Hey guys, Jonathan with Brakes to Go here. We're going to be doing a simple rotor and pad replacement on the front of this Nissan Versa. I'm going to go over a quick demonstration on a general brake pad and rotor replacement. Most of the procedures that I'm going to show you are going to apply to 90% of the vehicles to replace rotors and pads, at least on the front end. The back end can have some other variables with electronic parking brakes and parking brakes in general. So today, the tools that we're going to need are, and you don't have to have these specific tools. You can do it with lesser tools. This just makes the job easier. I'm using an impact, a half-inch impact to remove the lug nuts. You could use a breaker bar and then spin them off on the ground and then jack it up later. Obviously, a jack, you can use a scissor jack that comes in for emergencies, but that would slow down the process. You make sure you have a jack stand as well under it. What you can't see is the rear wheels are chalked as well. Then we're gonna have a brake cleaner to clean the rotors, the oil that's residual. We're using Platinum Professional rotors from CarQuest that are painted and original equipment spec. And then we're using Akebono brake pads on the front end of this car. These are ultra premium brake pads that are going to exceed or match OEM technology in this car. Some of the other tools that we're going to need is a hammer to break away the rotors if they're rusted onto the hub. I do have a 3/8 impact, which can be substituted for just a ratchet to remove the slide pins on the back of the caliper, the bolts for the slide pins. I'm using just a flathead screwdriver to pry at the caliper if it's stuck. This is a brake piston compressor that when you actuate will push the piston in on the brake caliper. You can use a C-clamp. You can also, you can wedge the caliper against the brake pad, the old brake pad like this with a screwdriver, and that can push the piston back in as well. I do have a brake bleeder pump here. This is not what I'm going to use to bleed the brakes because we won't need to. This is what I'll use if the master cylinder overflows because we're pushing fluid back up to that master, and I will show that as well. Then when we finish up with the job, I will torque the wheels down with a torque wrench to make sure that they're to spec. And the next couple steps, I'll be just showing you a quick rundown of this brake pad replacement. All right, first things first, we're gonna remove this wheel here and then remove the caliper bracket bolts, and then, remove the caliper and then remove the caliper bracket bolts and remove the rotor. From there, we'll be installing the new rotors and the new brake pads. First step would be, if you do not have an impact like this that's powerful enough to spin the lug nuts off, I would suggest if you have a socket, breaking it loose, or using a breaker bar to break it loose, spinning the lug nuts a little bit while it's still on the ground, jacking it up, and then twisting them off the rest of the way. Once you have that loose, put your bolts somewhere where they won't roll away on you. Move the tire out of your work area. At this point, what we're looking at is the rotor, the lug studs themselves that come through the rotor from the hub, the caliper and the caliper bracket, brake hose, shock, the rest of the wheel well here. So our next step here would be to remove these 14mm bolts on the back side. I do have a 3/8 impact, but what you could easily do is use a ratcheting ratchet here and remove them if you do not have equipment like this. So I'm going to pop these guys off real quick. And then sometimes these calipers can be tricky where they're stuck. This one actually happens to be pretty loose, which is surprising as rusted as it is. But you can carefully pry at the caliper if your caliper isn't coming loose. Also, if it still doesn't, you can get in here and pull pressure against this back piston of this caliper to help relieve some of the pressure that's on the piston of the caliper, which I'm going to show you right now. And then that will unsandwich these brake pads. Once you apply that pressure here, this will push this piston back in, allowing this caliper to come freely. Now, you don't ever want to let your calipers hang. I am just setting that on the rotor, but they do have caliper hooks that you can hook to the shocks. to make sure that your calipers aren't stretching out these brake hoses here and compromising them in any way at all. Next, most sockets on the back end of the caliper bracket are going to be bigger. This guy is a 17 millimeter, which isn't some of the bigger ones, but it's still a decent sized socket. You would want a 3/8 ratchet, which I'm not using. I have a big heavy impact here, which is fantastic and makes for easy use. But you could use a 1/2 inch ratchet to remove these, or a long wrench with an extension to get it to remove it. I'm going to pull the brake pads out of the slot so they don't fall down. Even though this hardware and these brake pads, these are really poor quality brake pads. We're removing these not just because of the brake pads, but because the rotors have warped. That has to do with the quality of the brake pad not pulling heat out of the rotor, as well as the quality of the rotor as well. So now that we have that all out of the way, we will take off these caliper bracket bolts in the back. Caliper bracket slides right off. Now you want to check these slide pins here, see that they're free. If they're seized up, you would have to replace either a bracket or the caliper assembly itself. This rotor is being nice to us and sliding right off of there. That isn't always what we see, especially with all the rust that you see here. This rotor on this back side of this hub here can get fused to this, I don't know if fused is the right term, but rusted onto this hub here. You need to take some moderate swings at it, the rotor, to free it. Usually you can hit it on the hub. If that's not working, you can move to the outside, but you would never want to hit the outside if for some reason you're removing the rotor and reusing it. So in the next steps, I'll be showing you cleaning the new rotors and the new brake pads, looping them up and installing them. All right, the next step would be to open up your rotor box as well as your brake pad box, get your materials ready, get your hardware ready to install the rotors and the brake pads. In this case, most rotors are going to be packaged with oil to make sure that they're not rusting in shipment. You can't just throw a rotor on there. That will cause nightmare issues down the road. So you'll see all this film is on here. It's a nice looking rotor. It's got cross hatching on it, painted on the outside and paint on the front end of that. What I'm going to do, and you can use soap and water as well, we pay for a high quality brake clean that does a great job of removing all the oil off of the rotor. So I'm going to clean the rotor entirely off. Make sure that when I look at it, there isn't any residual oil left on it. Now a trick, see how this rotor just wants to sag on here? Even if I push it up, it just wants to sag on there. Getting the caliper on that way can be pretty tricky. So one of the shortcuts that you can do, or tricks I should say, to keep the rotor from falling on you, and some will have a little set screws from the factory that you can install the rotor with, is to just fasten down a lug nut like that so that the rotor is in the position that it will most likely be whenever it's mounted with the wheel mounted. Now I got some grease marks on here, so go ahead and spray those off there. Don't want any of that on the surface of the rotor itself. Next we'd be installing our caliper bracket here. This bracket looks pretty rough. As long as where your hardware sits is nice and cleaned out and smooth, and your hardware can slide on, that's what you want. This hardware has these little sort of spring-loaded hardware on them to ensure that it pulls the brake pad away from the rotor whenever it's not compressing. So you're gonna throw that guy, put it on the right way, throw that guy in there, make sure it sits nice and flush. And I will say that these things can give you a hell of a time sometimes. hardware here, but I have multiple options. That is the right one. All right, so once you have your hardware on, since your rotor is in place where it needs to be, you would go ahead and fasten your bracket back on to the back of the hub. 17 millimeter screw here. Big screw, looks just like this. And thread everything before you tighten it down. And I have an impact here, but I'm only gonna go until it just starts to get tight. Remove my socket there. Make sure the rotor sits nice and flush in between there. And then I'm going to hand tighten this with a 17 millimeter 3/8 as to not over tighten the threads. Now, the next part would be to inspect these slide pins. See all this rust that's gotten on here? Well, you might not be able to see from there, but basically a bunch of rust has dropped down this slide pin. We don't want any of that corrosion inside the slide pin. We're gonna go ahead and clean that off. Take both slide pins out. And this one normally has a rubber boot on it. Then we're going to take our lube, which I swore we brought with us, we did, and lube up these slide pins here. This is one of the most crucial parts of the brake jobs. If you skip this, your caliper can seize up and not move freely. You want this slide pin to move in and out without any resistance, because that is just a little bit of pullback on the caliper to ensure that the brakes can move freely in and out. Otherwise, if they get seized up on there, it's going to warp the rotor, maybe possibly ruin the caliper, and ruin the brake pads. You would have to have a whole new brake job after doing that, which is no bueno, nothing anyone wants. I also put a little bit of lube on the brake pads here. On the ears of the brake pad, so that they are not just metal on metal in here. And what I like to do is these little slide pin clips that are on this Versa, which aren't going to be on everything, is I start them. I start them before I push the brake pad in. And then when I push the brake pad in the slot, the little hardware is already trying to push this brake pad out. Obviously we're going to install a brake pad on the other side and then button her up, but I want to try to keep it short, so I did want to show compressing this piston in. This piston is slightly out. You do want to make sure the master cylinder fluid is not overflowing, which I will show in another clip where the master cylinder itself is, and removing the cap and making sure that the fluid doesn't. Because once you overflow, because once you push this piston in, it pushes hydraulic fluid back to the top. And the last thing you want is to spill any hydraulic fluid on the ground, staying in your driveway, anything like that. It's not close to overflowing up top. So I push this guy in. I make sure there's not a lot of resistance as I push that piston back. If your piston doesn't want to move, you could have a seized caliper, and that's not a situation that you want to be in. You're going to have to replace that caliper at that point. What's up with this hardware? All right, once your brake pads are in place and you've lubed your slide pins, go ahead and slide your caliper over your brake pads. You're gonna have to push these slide pins back in place so that it can fit over, and line them up. Once you do so, find your caliper slide pin bolts, hand thread them in, like I said for everything. Excuse the truck in the background. Once you've hand threaded them, I'm going to use a impact to get it down quicker. Then I'm going to go ahead and hand tighten them with a ratchet. This is a 14 millimeter. Never want to over tighten those bolts. You could break a slide pin bolt, or worse off, you don't know that you've over tightened it, and then later it comes off once you've finished the brake job. At this point, you ensure that all your bolts have been tightened. Double check your work. Look at your back bolts, make sure that nothing's loose. Remove your lug nut here, and then reinstall your tire. Once again, you need to hand, and these guys are really tricky on these Nissans because they're very shallow, very deep, I should say, lug nut holes, but the lug nut is so tiny and short that you've got to get your fingers in there. And what I do is I get one tight, and then I can do the rest. And not, obviously don't tighten it all the way with the impact if you have one. You don't want to strip these guys. That's a, when you do that, it's bad. Big pain in the butt. Alrighty. At this point, we can move our jack stand, lower the vehicle, and tighten it up with a torque wrench. This is the jack stand I realized was not in frame anymore. Move it up and down, put it under the frame rail. Lower the jack. Oh, I'm sorry. For this vehicle, what I've set it, the torque rating to is 95 foot-pounds is the torque required for this vehicle wheel. And then you'll hear it whenever it clicks like that, and you'll repeat the process for all four. I'm not going to show you the other side of the brake pad and rotor installation, but I am going to show you the proper setting of these brake pads after we're done with the brake job. Here's the master cylinder that I'm talking about, the cap to the master cylinder. When you're pushing the brake fluid back in, squeezing that thing, it's pushing fluid back up here. You want to make sure that you don't get past the fill line. Unfortunately, the fill line is pretty hard to see on this one. We're all in all right shape here, as we have not surpassed it. And you don't want fluid to obviously flow out of the master cylinder cap. Okay, we finished up our brake job on this Nissan Sentra, and now it's time to set the brakes. Depending on what you read online and how to break in the brakes and make the brake pads set fully to the rotor will vary. I use ASC standards, which is 2 to 3 times. You're going to speed up to 35 miles an hour and come to a gradual stop to 5 miles an hour. I'm sorry, not a gradual stop, come to a 5 mile an hour roll. You do this 2 to 3 times. I would give about 20 to 30 seconds in between each of these brakings, if you can, to let the brakes cool slightly. And then 4 to 5 times from 55 miles an hour to 5 mile an hour slow roll. You would then want to just drive the vehicle normally back to wherever your home, your shop, wherever you're located, and allow the brakes to cool before 1 hour before driving the car again. I still would not recommend heavy braking after replacing new brakes, as even though that braking procedure works quite well and will set the brakes thoroughly to the rotors, the car will only continue to become better at braking as the car is driven under normal operating circumstances. This is because of any oil being burned off, the rotors setting themselves to the rotors and conforming quite well, so that whenever you stop, it has the maximum friction when rubbing against the rotor. Thanks for coming with me today on how to change brake pads on this Sentra. I hope this has been helpful for you.